So yeah, my name's Matthew, and I'm going to talk about my work on generating varied, stable, and solvable levels for Angry Bird-style physics games. So first, I want to give just a bit of background about our research group and the work that we do. We are colloquially, I guess, known as the AI Birds Research Group, and we're predominantly interested in research around physics-based games and trying to deal with all the additional complications and challenges that this domain brings. Historically, we've been more around researching and developing AI agents for interacting with these physics domains, but more recently, we've been looking at ways of creating realistic and viable physical content, which is what this talk here is about. So hopefully most of you are at least familiar with the game Angry Birds. For those who aren't, it's a simple physics-based puzzle game in which the player has to shoot various different types of birds at structures composed of blocks, with the player's goal being to kill pigs that are located within these structures by hitting them. This game has many different bird types and abilities, as well as various game items that the player has to deal with. We like this game a lot, though, because even though the physics are fairly complex compared to most other arcade-style games, it's very simple to learn. Children can pick up and play Angry Birds within a few minutes, but we can really create some difficult levels should we choose to. So over the past half a decade or so, our group has been heavily involved in the Angry Birds AI agent competition, which has the goal of developing agents that can successfully play Angry Birds levels better than humans. We haven't quite got the better than humans part yet, but we're working on it, and hopefully we'll get there soon. But one of the main problems with this competition has been that there's a severe lack of pre-made levels that are available. The original Angry Birds game, which is used in this competition, is just over 100 levels, which really isn't enough if you want to perform deep learning or any other meaningful training. So we came up with a solution of developing a sophisticated level generator. And that's what we did. So we have created a procedural content generation algorithm that can generate levels in physics-based puzzle games similar to Angry Birds. We do actually use Angry Birds itself for all our examples, but the techniques and methods described can be used in any physics game that has structures composed of smaller subblocks. So yeah, this involves the design and placement of multiple structures throughout the level space, with these structures being composed of many blocks of different shapes, sizes, and materials. All the levels we generate must be solvable and stable. These were two very important things for us. If a level is not solvable, it's of no use to training an agent, and it's of no fun to a human player. And then if the level's far too easy, you get pretty much the same effect. We also really wanted to make sure that our levels were stable, especially with a physics game. If you create these structures and then they immediately just fall down when you try to actually initialize and play the level, that's no good to anyone. Some additional considerations we look at include things such as identifying suitable item locations, weak point protection, terrain variation, and material and bird type selection. And I'll talk about each of these in more detail as I go through this talk. We can also evaluate our levels using a fitness function, which allows us to improve or tailor the content we create over subsequent generations. But first, how do we actually generate the structures that we're going to put in our levels? Our structures are built recursively out of rows of blocks, starting with the top row of the structure, if you like, or the peak, and then recursively adding more and more rows below that until you reach a desired height or width or depth or number of blocks, whatever you want. The block type for each row is determined stochastically using a probability table. These 12 blocks here, hopefully you can see them, are the 12 blocks that are currently available in Angry Birds. Blocks 1 to 8 are what we refer to as rectangular or regular blocks. These make up the sort of core, if you like, of our structures, with blocks 9 to 12 called irregular blocks, sort of scattered throughout the level space afterwards. Our structures can have multiple peaks by simply defining multiple blocks in the top row, and then new rows added by first dividing the bottom of the current structure into subsets based on the distances of the blocks. So sort of if you take this left image here, this is sort of a half generated structure. If you like, we can add a new row by dividing the bottom row of blocks into different subset combinations, as indicated by the red, blue, and green lines. You then pick one and add your new row of blocks in one of 7 different supporting block placement options using any combination of the 3 placement options on the right there. Multiple local stability requirements can be enforced to increase the likelihood of global structural stability. It doesn't guarantee it, but it sure as hell makes it more likely. Structures can be placed either on the ground or on platforms depending on the space available in the level. So here are 3 examples of the sort of structures we can create using this algorithm. So now we've got our level and it's full of these structures. We need to populate it with pigs or target locations that the player has to hit. We identify possible locations for pigs both within and on top of structures as well as on the ground. These locations are then ranked based on 3 factors. The first is structural protection, which is a measure of how much protection that location has from any incoming attacks by the player. Pig dispersion, which is a measure of how spread out the locations are. Even if there's a really secure location, we don't want to place all the pigs there or put all our eggs in one basket, so to speak. We want a nice spread of locations throughout the level. And the last one is what we call occupancy estimation, which is a measure of how likely we think that location is to be hit by any falling blocks from above. Pigs are then iteratively placed at the most desirable locations until a desired number is reached, and then other irregular blocks can be placed at any of the remaining locations. So here's a sort of example level using this quite simple generation process. As you can see, there are 3 ground structures and 2 structures on top of platforms, with pigs and other irregular blocks sort of placed throughout the level. But there's a bunch of other additional things we can do to try and improve the quality of the levels we generate. The first is weak point protection, where we identify weak points in our level, which are defined as reachable blocks, that is blocks that can be hit directly by the player, such that if that block was to be removed, a large number of other objects would be affected. Blocks that are identified as potential weak points can then be protected in one of several ways. The first is to place additional protection structures next to the weak point, effectively making it no longer reachable. In this sort of picture down here, the tall, thin wooden block was identified as a weak point, so we sort of place this tower of blocks next to it to try and protect it a bit. We can also add additional support blocks on the same row as the weak point to reduce the number of blocks that would be affected by its removal. And lastly, we can simply improve the material robustness, which in this case means just setting the material to stone, which is the strongest material in the game. Another minor thing we can do is block swapping, where with our previously described algorithm, each row of a structure has the same block type. What we can do is we can swap out blocks in a row with other blocks as long as they have the same height and support requirements. So in this sort of middle ground structure here, you can see that each row of the structure, all the blocks are the same height, but we do vary the type of blocks within each row as well. Terrain variation is another small addition, where instead of placing our ground structures actually on the ground, we can use platform blocks to sort of create these nice hills and other terrain shapes, which just adds a bit of variety to the levels we create. All right, TNT placement. So TNT boxes are one of the most common items in Angry Birds. These are boxes that if the player hits them, they explode and damage nearby objects. So we looked into this and we decided on a system. First, we identify possible TNT locations the same way as pigs, and then we give each of these locations a score based on these 3 values. The first is the proximity of that location to pigs and other weak points, effectively how much damage will a TNT that's placed there actually do if it does explode. The second one is the dispersion of locations. Again, we don't want to clump all our TNT boxes too close together. And the third one is the likelihood of that location being hit by any blocks or balls from above, previously called occupancy estimation. Okay, so as we previously stated, stability was a really important thing for us. We really wanted to make sure that our structures were stable. And while we do enforce local stability during generation, this is no guarantee that the structure will be globally stable once you actually put it in the game. So we used a quantitative stability analysis method to try and verify the stabilities of our structures. But we found out that, unfortunately, the Angry Birds game engine is not quite 100% accurate, and that it suffers from several simulation inaccuracies that make it, not very good, frankly. Structures that may be theoretically stable when you actually put them in the game just fall down. So we had to tinker around with a bit But we found that by assuming zero friction and doing a bit of other small minor changes, we were able to effectively eliminate the risk of false positives at the weakness of increasing the number of false negatives. If a structure is found or suspected to be unstable using this calculation, then we discard the structure and create another one. Okay, there are currently 3 types of material in Angry Birds that a block can have. It can be either ice, wood, or stone, with ice being the weakest and stone being the strongest material in the game. So when selecting a material for a particular block, we came up with 5 different approaches for doing so. The first is trajectory analysis, where we identify possible trajectories from the slingshot on the left, where the player makes their shots, to pigs, TNTs, and weak points. For each of these trajectories, there's then a chance that all the blocks that intersect it will be set to the same material. So a good example of this is on this bottom picture here. Hopefully you can make it out. The middle ground structure, there's sort of this tunnel, if you like, of ice blocks that leads from the birds on the left to the pigs on the right, perhaps incentivizing the player to make this shot. Clustering is another option where we group blocks together based on their sizes and distances. Row grouping, where we set each row of the structure to a random material. Structure grouping, where we make the whole structure a random material, although this is typically only reserved for smaller structures. And then random selection, where we simply randomly select each block's material. Bird number selection is probably the most important thing in terms of difficulty or solvability in a level. You know, if you give the player an infinite number of birds, every level becomes solvable. But if you don't give the player enough birds, the level may potentially be unsolvable. So we came up with 2 ways of determining the bird number selection. The first is a very simple method in which we use a function that takes into account the number of pigs, blocks, weak points, structures, TNT protection metrics, and dispersion of elements. So while this is, it's a function, it's very simple and quick to calculate, it does have the limitation in that it can sometimes give unsolvable levels. No matter how much you fine-tune these parameters, there's always that risk. So a more complex way we used was to give the player the same number of birds as used by the best performing agent. By taking all the agents that have been involved in the past Angry Birds AI competitions and applying them to our generated levels, we can get a much better estimate of how many birds a player should need. This is a much slower approach, as it takes each agent between 1 and 2 minutes to solve a level on average. But it does guarantee that you will get a solvable level, as you're going to give the player as many birds as used by an agent. An agent's already solved it, so the player can as well. Determining the type of the birds is also very important. There are 5 types of birds available: red, blue, yellow, black, and white. The red bird has no special ability. The blue bird is strong against ice blocks, the yellow bird is strong against wood blocks, and the black bird is strong against stone blocks, and the white bird drops an explosive egg. There are some other abilities as well, but these are the ones we're going to focus on. So what we did was we assigned each of these bird types a score based on the calculations on the right there. For the red bird, it was the number of reachable, or pigs that can be hit directly, over the total number of pigs. For the blue, yellow, and black birds, it was the number of ice, wood, and stone blocks, respectively, over the number of blocks. And for the white bird, it was the number of protected pigs, or pigs that are protected within a structure, over the number of pigs. These scores are then normalized to give a desired bird type ratio, and then each time a new bird is added, it is done so in an attempt to minimize the error between the actual and desired ratio bird types. So if you can imagine there's a level with a large number of wooden blocks, you'll find that the yellow bird score is going to be much higher than the others, and then the player will be given a much higher number of yellow birds compared to other types. The last thing we can do is we can also evolve our structure's design over multiple generations. So while this can be done on more designer-specific things, if you like, we came up with 3 factors that we believe are sort of universally good, if you like, that sort of every level would like to have. They are known as the pig placement potential, which is the dispersion of pig locations over the number of pig locations. Effectively, we want levels that have a large number of well-dispersed places where you could put pigs. Block type variety, which is the variety of block types in your structures. Structures with only 1 or 2 block types generally aren't as interesting as ones with more block types, and structure robustness, which is how resilient that structure is against forces that are applied to it. While this could sort of work both ways, we found through our experimentations that structures that sort of fell down immediately after the slightest tap generally weren't as interesting as structures that took a couple more hits to fall down. So we tried to make our structures a bit more robust. The sum of these components then gives structures fitness value, the generalized formula given on the bottom there. And then the probability of selecting a particular block type during structure generation can be updated or altered based on this value. So the first thing we evaluated was the optimization potential of our block selection method using this fitness function. To do this, we came up with an approach where we created 9 different structures for each generation of our evolution, and then ranked these 9 structures based on their fitness function values. Then for each structure, its rank, as well as the frequency of block types within it, was used to update our probability table. As you can see, the graph on the bottom shows its update over 300 generations, indicating that our method can be highly customizable or tailorable based on the designer's wishes. We also believe that our generator has a much greater variety of content compared to other previous level generators. As far as we're aware, this is the first Angry Birds generator to consider things such as TNT blocks, different bird types, intelligent material selection, using agents to evaluate difficulty and things like that. So we think this is a quite nice improvement over the previous work. We also looked at the expressivity of the levels we generated using 4 different metrics: frequency, linearity, density, and leniency. The graph on the left shows frequency values for each block type, and we think this is a reasonably nice spread. There's no one block type that's much higher or much lower than any other. Linearity showed that our generated levels were highly nonlinear, which is always good. Density, we got just under 30%, which is, again, this is a highly subjective thing, but we feel this is about right. But the main one I wanted to talk about was leniency, or difficulty, as it could also be known. So to investigate this, we took the 8 best Angry Birds agents from last year's AI Birds competition and ran them on our generated levels to see how well they performed. What we found was that the best performing agent was the Data Lab agent, both in terms of lowest shots and also fastest runtime. So as a comparison, if we're just using this agent, say, to determine the number of birds to give the player, we found that running on a pretty basic desktop PC, the average runtime of our whole method was 132.6 seconds. So that's just over 2 minutes to create a fully stable and solvable level, which we feel is pretty good. Also, if we compare these well-performing agents against more naive approaches, we found that it did, in most cases, vastly outperform them. So in conclusion, our level generator can create a wide range of levels, utilizing many different game elements. There's a large amount of designer flexibility available. All the levels we create are stable, all the levels we create are solvable, and the levels we create typically require more than naive strategies to solve them. Skill is needed. As we're using these skilled agents to determine how many birds to give the player, and as naive strategies cannot solve the level using this many birds, it stands to reason that you do need some creativity in solving them. Thank you.
All right, time for questions.
It's time for everyone.
Yeah, nice work. I just had a question. Do you know how, like, the sort of metrics you showed at the end and like the bot, how does it actually compare to like original Angry Bird levels? Like, is that like, is the best on your levels the best on the original levels? Or
yeah. So what we found was that then they're reasonably the same. If I can get back to it, you mean?
Yeah, like
this
that.
one.
Like, does Data Lab do the best?
Okay.
Is Data Lab the best on the
Yeah,
others?
so it actually
like
turns out that is the
3.5,
case. Some of them are quite far off. IHSev, for example, did really bad. But in the actual Angry Birds game, it did pretty well. So this might indicate that, for example, that agent uses some more defined things that it knows are in those original levels when solving them, whereas a more general agent that can easily adapt to, the thousands of levels we can create is probably a better way of doing things.
Hi, awesome. It just strikes me that you are creating separately the structure of the level and then choosing the birds and the bird types.
Yes.
In my understanding, a lot of real Angry Birds levels have a very tight connection between the structure and the sequence, the types and sequence of birds you are having. You are not doing that, so can you elaborate on how
we
you
were
could take that
looking
into
this by just using, again, the agents to try out different combinations to see what worked best, that sort of thing. In the Angry Birds games, if there's a very tightly defined puzzle, if you like to think of that as like an exact sequence of shots you have to carry out, then definitely that's a sort of structured thing. But for us, it was more sort of the general look of things. So we try to look at the materials of blocks and how that relates to certain bird types, like the blue and yellow bird and stuff like that. But then also how the pigs are located within the structures for things like the white bird and the red bird and things like that. And then when we determine the bird type and the order, that's based on the expected scores for each bird type. So if there's a lot of wooden birds, you probably get a yellow bird first, and then maybe another one later down the line, or something like that.
Yes, you're taking into account the amount of blocks, not the position or the accessibility or the sequence.
We didn't take into account the exact number of blocks. We took into account the number of each block material, if you like. So if there's a lot of ice blocks, you're going to get a high bluebird score, for example.
Any more questions? All right, so let's take our speaker again.
And the guy from before. Now presenting another thing. This work has been developed by me together with Alex Baldwin and Johan Holmberg, who is over there. Say hi. Hi, hi. And Steve Darskuk, all of them from together with me from Malmö University. Okay, so this is like 2 Swedes, a Spaniard, and a British enter a bar, and they came up with a mixed initiative procedural content generation thingy. Sounds like a joke, but it's real. So this thing came out of something that was previously done in Spain, okay, back in Madrid at my previous university. This is a master thesis from some guy called Roberto Izquierdo and some Swedish guy that you may know over there. In this master thesis, we developed a system, that we call the evolutionary world generator, world designer, which looks like this, more or less. This is a procedural content generation tool for generating maps for adventure games, okay? This was published in EvoStar 2016, okay? And in here, with this tool, this is supposed to be used by a game designer who wants to design an adventure game, like a Zelda game, okay? So this person can specify up there number of areas or zones that he wants to include in the map for the game, okay? And he can also specify the number of rooms or that he wants to be included inside each of the areas of the map, okay? So after clicking generate, we get 2 different sets of graphs, okay? The one on the upper side of the slide is a high-level graph in which we interconnect areas, okay, high-level areas. And each of those areas is composed by another graph, which may contain cycles in this case, okay? That's why you see 6 different levels over there on the right side of the screen, each of them containing a low-level graph that represents a dungeon, okay, of interconnected rooms. So this was completely automatically generated by the system. All the levels are solvable. We are using grammatical evolution here. All the details for this are already written on the paper, but I want you to know this because this was the first step on this project. Okay. So that the next step, which is the one that I'm presenting here, is this one. We had already a high-level generator for these kind of Zelda-like games, but the rooms that we were including in our dungeons were a bit kind of empty. So they contained things, but they were almost placeholders, okay? So the content of each of the rooms in the dungeons was just placed there by no given reason, okay? So at this point, we were thinking about, what if we just take a step forward, and now we code another evolutionary algorithm in order to fill in each of the rooms, okay? So that after generating the high-level map, we can move down to each of the rooms, and then we can double-click on each of them, for instance, and then we run another genetic algorithm or something like that that provides suggestions to us in order to how to better fill in with content all of those rooms, okay? So that's where this evolutionary dungeon designer came from, which we familiarly call Eddie, okay? So this is the word I'm presenting here, but I want you to know that this is the second step in a bigger project. The first one is the high-level generator, okay, published in EvoStar. Now here I'm talking about the first step in the evolutionary dungeon designer, Eddie, but I want you to know that there's another, this is not the current state of the software. There is a more newer version of the software that was presented like 10 days ago by one of the co-authors at the procedural content generation workshop at the FDG 2017. It happens that this work that I'm presenting right now was submitted before the other one, the second one, but it's going to be presented now after the other one because, you know, deadlines, okay? But you must know that the work that I'm presenting right now is not the current status of the tool, okay? It's a previous one. But I'm also mentioning this because I'm very happy because recently this whole project, which is an ongoing project, has been funded by the Kraftful Foundation, which is a Swedish research institution, okay? So this is a 2 years project, now has some funds to be done in the next 2 years, okay? And there are some plans for it. But now, some related work. We carried out a pretty nice state-of-the-art analysis, but here I want to highlight a couple of works that were very inspirational to us. First one is this paper called Patterns, Dungeons, and Generators by one of our co-authors, Steve Dalskog, Staffan Björk, and yet another Swedish guy that you may know probably. And in this paper, which is pretty interesting, they come up, among many other things, they present a definition for something that is called game pattern as a commonly recurring part of the design of a game that concerns gameplay, okay? And they are mainly focused in game design patterns for dungeons or dungeon-like games or adventure games, okay? So we got inspiration and some ideas from this paper, and you need to know for this work here that these patterns that were presented in this paper were sorted into 3 different categories: micro patterns, meso patterns, and macro patterns, according to some features belonging to each of those. So, and this is the second word that was very inspirational to us. You probably know it. If you don't know it yet, you actually need to hurry up and Google Sentient Sketchbook, okay, because this is a super awesome work by Antonios Leapis and his PhD directors, okay, as a mixed initiative tool to help designers create maps for real-time strategy games, okay. So we took this work as a long-term goal inspiration, let's call it that way, and we wanted to follow it in order to shape our software. This is how Eddie, the evolutionary dungeon designer, looked by the time in which this paper was written. It is a software in which we can set up a lot of features over there. Some of them are related to the genetic algorithm because Eddie runs a genetic algorithm, and Eddie provides, according to some features that it inputs from a user who might be a game designer, inputs those features and then provides suggestions, rooms that are completely generated from scratch through this genetic algorithm, okay? And these suggestions may be taken by the game designer in order to, in a later stage, update them, modify them, or include them in a final game, okay? So at this stage, Eddie was able to develop one room at each time, okay? The genetic algorithm that we are implementing here is a feasible-invisible 2-population genetic algorithm that I will explain a bit more in detail later. The initial population is completely randomized, and then we let the user set up a few parameters that may help the system know or grasp the idea that the designer has in his mind about the rooms that he wants to be generated. So taking these parameters into account, we code a genetic algorithm, and so we need to define the representation, the codification system for our individuals. So in this case, we are coding dungeons for adventure games. So we code those dungeons as b-dimensional arrays composed that contain numbers, like those you see over there. On the right side of the slide, you can see the genotype, the chromosome of one of our individuals. And then on the right side, you can see its corresponding phenotype. Okay, that's with this very simple mechanism, we are able to code into a genotype typical standard map for an adventure game. The floor tiles that we are, the tiles that we are using in for our map generator are those 6 different types of tiles. Floor tile, also known as passable terrain, because it's a tile that the player may walk over it or through it. A wall, that's impassable terrain. Then enemies, and in this case is kind of a generic enemy. We make no differences at this stage between different kinds of enemies, just enemy. Then treasures, the same, only one kind of treasure. And then 2 types of doors. The entrance, also known as the main door, which is the door that through which the player enters the room for the very first time. Okay? And then the other doors, regular doors. The player can go through those doors in both directions. Okay? So after this, we define some constraints, very little constraints. Any room might have at least 1 door and a maximum number of 4 doors. Okay? One of those should be the main door, the entrance. And then we define what we call the playability constraint, because we want to provide suggestions that we know for sure that are playable, solvable. Okay? So we define playability like that. There must be in any playable room at least 1 treasure, at least 1 enemy, and the player should be able to reach any door, treasure, and enemy from the main entrance. Otherwise, the room is not considered playable. Okay? And then we encode the room as I explained before, and we use all these elements in feasible, invisible, 2 populations genetic algorithm. This means that instead of having 1 standard population, we have 2 of them. In one of them, we only place the rooms that are feasible, okay, that satisfy the playability constraint. And on the other population, we store the individuals that do not satisfy the playability constraint. Because, during the genetic algorithm, this is not a grammar-guided genetic algorithm, so we might generate solutions that are not valid, that do not satisfy the playability constraint. So instead of throwing away those solutions, we store them in a second population. Why? Because we do believe that by evolving that second population on its own, separately, eventually, we may come up with some individuals that are valid out of 2 individuals that are invalid. And that happens, okay? That's why we preserve the second population and we evolve it in parallel at the same time as we evolve the first valid population, okay? And each of those populations evolves completely separately from each other. So now we have the codification, now we know how the GA works. The only thing that is left is the fitness function, okay? So in here, we take inspiration from the game design patterns, and then we evaluate the rooms according to 2 different kinds of patterns that were introduced in the paper that I mentioned before. Inventorial micro patterns that are doors, treasures, and enemies contained in the room, and then spatial micro patterns, which are corridors and chambers, okay? Being chamber, a term that actually we have to invent, because in the previous paper, room was used for defining what we call a chamber, which is how can we define this? Like a mini room inside the whole room. We were already using room for the whole thing, okay, the whole individual, but we want to specify that we might encounter some rooms inside the bigger room. So in order to not to use the same term twice with two different definitions, we use chamber for the other one, okay? So our bigger room may contain corridors and chambers inside, interconnected, okay? So based on these two different patterns, we compose our fitness function. All the math that is beneath this fitness calculation, you can find it on the paper, and I am not stopping at the math right now because I think that is there's no point on that, but I want you to understand how do we evaluate these rooms, okay? So related to the inventorial micropatterns, the tools, treasures, and enemies, what we do is this. We calculate several features from each room that we want to evaluate. The first thing is the entrance safety fitness. This is a fitness, a measure that calculates the size of the largest circular area centered on the main entrance. So we have a flock fill algorithm that is centered on the main door, the entrance of the room, and then we start filling in the room, like simulating kind of a fluid or water, and we stop filling in the room when we find the first enemy in the room, okay? And that's what we call the entrance safety, so that we can easily calculate the area in the number of tiles that are contained in this safe area, the area that is between the main door and the first enemy that we find in the room. Then we have the entrance grid fitness, which is an analogous concept, but instead of measuring the distance between the entrance and the enemies, we measure the distance between the entrance and each of the treasure tiles, okay? Because we consider that if the treasures are super close to the entrance, then the level, the room, might be considered an easy level, because the treasures are pretty easy to reach from the main entrance. If they are far away from the entrance, then the room might be considered more difficult, because the player has to walk a lot, maybe defeat some enemies until he's able to get the treasures. And then the treasure density, which is just calculating the proportion of treasures in the room according to the number of passable tiles. Not the size of the room, but the number of passable tiles. This was very important. And then the enemy density fitness, which is analogous to the treasure density, but in this case, we calculate the number of enemies against the number of passable tiles. And then the treasure safety fitness, which is pretty cool. Yeah, 5 minutes. Thank you. Because in this case, we get a measure that combines two things. We want to evaluate how safe each treasure is. And we do that by measuring the distance from a single treasure to the main entrance and to the closest enemy. Because maybe a treasure might be very close to the entrance, but also super close to an enemy. That doesn't mean that the treasure is easy to get. Can be easy because it's close to the entrance, but it can be hard as well because it's super next to an enemy. So we are taking both things into account in order to calculate the treasure safety fitness. And according to the spatial micropatterns, corridors and chambers, well, corridors, you can see samples over there on the right side of the slide of chambers and corridors, and then you can see also two joints and a turn. Those are special instances of corridors, okay? We call them connectors, because what they do is that they connect corridors, okay, by creating joints or turns, okay? So we take those into account as well when we calculate this spatial micropattern fitness. What we calculate is those things. What you can see here displayed in blue color is the number of, the rooms that are automatically detected by the tool. Okay, and then what it is displayed in kind of orange red thingy are the corridors that have been automatically detected by the tool. So what we do is that we calculate the chamber ratio, which is a proportion of passable tiles in a room that belong to chambers, okay? And then we add to that measure what we define as the quality of a chamber. One or two of the features that the human designer might tune before running the generation algorithm is the size, the target size of the chambers that might be contained in the generated rooms, and also the squareness of those chambers, okay? Meaning that we provide the designer with a number through which he can specify how square the chambers that might appear in the individuals may look like, okay? So he can define if he wants super square rooms or more organical, not square rooms, okay? So those things are included into what we call the quality of the detected chambers. And then we also have the chamber fitness, which is the degree to which the chamber rate differs from a user-defined target rate that is called T-chamber. Then we have, analogously, more or less, the corridor ratio, the proportion of passable tiles that belong to corridors, added to the quality of those corridors, and then the corridor fitness, which is measuring the length of the corridors that appear in the room against the target length that was defined by the user, okay? So, and on the other side, we have the second population composed by invisible individuals. What you see right here is an individual that is invisible, and the only thing that I had to do is to add an impossible tile right here. By doing this, this room is now unplayable because I cannot reach any of those 4 items. I cannot reach that treasure, those 2 enemies, and that door over there. So we count the number of patterns, inventory and patterns, that cannot be reached from the main entrance, and then we put those numbers into that fitness function. And that's a fitness function for the invisible individuals, okay? And now results. We have run out like a lot of experiments in the lab, and what we wanted to do, we wanted to test if the tool that was generated at this stage was capable of responding to the input parameters specified by the designer, okay? If the designer wants this, so he sets the parameters like this, are we providing suggestions that are related to those parameters? And the other thing that we wanted to test out is the diversity of the solutions that were provided by the tool. Under the same set of parameters, are we capable of providing different looking solutions under the same settings? That's what we call diversity. So first, we test the first thing, and as you can see here, what we wanted to test, if we, by changing the value of the chamber corridor rate, which is those 2 values over here, okay, we were tuning those parameters, and we wanted to see if the result matches what we were intending to have. So in the first column named A, what we were aiming for was for creating rooms with no chambers, that's a 0% rate of chambers, and 100% rate of corridors. And that's what we are actually getting in the first solution. We get a solution, this is a very representative solution out of like a lot of runs that we did, and as you can see here, no chambers and a lot of corridors in the room. And then we are tuning those parameters by reducing the rate of corridors and increasing the chamber rate. So as you can see there, some chambers start over here. We have 1 chamber here, and then we have 2, 3, 1 more chamber, medium-sized chambers over there. And as we continue increasing this, more chambers appear, okay? And the thing that you see in the later picture is, in the last picture, is a very rare case that happens only 1 out of 3 times that we run this configuration here. We are aiming for 100% chambers, so no corridors. But we also force the evolutionary generator to give us a lot of squareness in the room. We are asking, in the chamber, sorry, we are asking him to provide super square rooms. So, okay, you asked for it. You were asking for super square rooms, and there you get it. The most square room in the wall, a room that actually has no walls at all. And that is a very rare case, but it only happens 1 out of 3 times that you run that specific configuration over there, okay? And as you can see here, this is something very fun that came out of the results. We discovered that those 2 patterns, chambers and corridors, they are opposite concepts. Because if we ask the generator to aim for corridors, then we are making it harder to produce chambers. And if we aim for chambers, then it's super hard to get corridors, okay? You can see that in the fitness evolution over there. We're aiming here for all corridors, but then when we ask for some chambers, then the fitness, the optimal fitness drops, or mostly in the chamber fitness, okay? Because if we produce corridors, we are preventing chambers to appear, okay? And here, what we did is just under the same set of settings, we just tune the value of the desired chamber area. So in the first 3 samples over there, we are increasing the target size for the chambers that we are asking for the generator. So in the first one, you see that we are getting very small chambers, and in the third one, you see pretty big chambers over there. And in the second row, what you see is the same set of settings, but we are only changing the squareness of the rooms. You are getting very organic looking chambers in the first room and super square, like man-made rooms in the last example. And then this is the last test, I promise, in which we were testing the diversity of the rooms. All these samples are from different evolutionary runs under the same, exactly the same set of settings, in order to test that we were able to provide diversity under the same set of settings. And as you can see right here, many different aspects in the rooms are achieved under the same settings. And actually, sometimes even some symmetry appears, but there's no symmetry coded inside the fitness function. It just came up. So in conclusion, we developed a system, we tested it against diversity and the relation between the input parameters and the output, and I think that we succeeded at it. So the next steps were including it in a mixed initiative tool and then integrating it with the actual existing evolutionary world designer. Sorry for taking too long. Open for questions.
Hi, I was just wondering, all of your room generations looked about the same size, like 10 by 10, I think.
Yeah.
Have you tried larger or smaller?
Yeah. The system is capable of generating any rooms of any size, but for the sake of simplicity of the samples that we are showing here, have the same size. But that's one of the settings that the user may set up, the size of the room.
And does that how does that affect the performance of the generator?
Well, if you aim for what was super like stupid big, when we were aiming for like 40 by 40 or something like that, that started to be slow. But these rooms are generated like in a second or something like that, so pretty fast.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hello.
Hi.
I'm making more like a philosophical comment. When I designed dungeons, and I designed many years ago, I always thought about why they were there, the purpose they were there, for what they were used. So to make sense, that's what the player is trying to find when he explores a dungeon. It's just not like killing random monsters and getting random treasury. And I would like a comment from you. So how do you try to incorporate this high-level thought process, and how?
The point is that at the current state of the tool, the thing that it does, well, the user interface is much evolved, because the point of this is that this is intended to be used by a human person who is designing maps for a game. So what we only do is to provide suggestions to speed up the task of creating like a lot of maps, a lot of dungeons. But the final decision of whether you want to place those rooms is up to the designer. So, and then also in the actual version of the software, we are also considering more high-level aspects or high-level patterns. If you remember, I talked before about micro patterns, meso patterns, and macro patterns. Now we have implemented some meso patterns that take into account where the enemies are placed, where the treasures are placed inside the chambers or next to a corridor or whatever, so that we allow the system to be aware of some high-level mechanics involved in these kind of games. And what we want to do next, apart from some other things, is to integrate high-level patterns in which maybe the system would be hopefully able to include concepts such as the ones you mentioned here.
All right.
I'm Daniele Iacono. I'm from Politecnico of Milano. I will present you this work I did with the students of our lab, Luca Arnaboldi. So basically, the first thing is what is the fight or flight response is basically a typical physiological reaction of animals to an imminent threat. So basically, when there is a danger, this is something also, of course, encoded in human DNA. basically you undergo this reaction that prepares your body to either fight or flee. And of course, apart from all the physiological changes of your body, you basically this kind of reaction also elicit a lot of strong emotions, and this is the reason we are interested to this concept in video games. So, what is the connection with video games? So basically, if you think about the typical horror games, in these kind of games, designer exploit this kind of fight or flight situation to elicit strong emotion in players, because you are constantly in danger, but you often have the possibility of escape, of avoiding a threat, and this keeps your stress level very high during all the game. Instead, if we think about another kind of games, competitive first-person shooters, in this kind of games, you basically don't have usually this kind of design. So typically, if you look at the typical, this is Quake and Call of Duty or these kind of games, the design is typically focused on a very fast pacing. They are very, very fast games. You typically don't have the possibility of fleeing. You typically focus on just fighting. So we in this work we wanted to investigate the possibility of design maps for these kind of games that instead can foster this kind of fleeing behavior, that can allow these kind of situations. So the goal was to try evolving maps for Cube 2 is an open source game, a first-person shooter game I will just introduce in a moment, that allows this kind of fleeing behavior. So Cube 2 is basically well-known already used in the research literature game. Is a first-person shooter game, is a competitive multiplayer first-person shooter, and the reason we use these kind of games is basically that it provides a very easy to use map editor. So basically, in Cube 2, the maps are built on top of this octree concept. So basically you have this recursive structure. This is a cube that can be ideally divided in 8 smaller cube in a recursive fashion. So you can design any kind of 3D structure by deciding which cube keep and remove, and going to any level of the recursion you want to design your 3D structure. So this allows to create several maps in even complex structures. We focus on much simpler kind of maps, so I will explain you later. But this is this kind of simple mechanism allows you also to have kind of more complex architecture in your map. And also another reason we chose this Cube 2 game is that it provides you several type of bots. Basically, it provides you an AI routine that can play the game, and this is very important for us in this project because we used the AI to evaluate the maps, as you see later. So, first of all, how we represented the map in this work. The map encoding is based on a previous work from Cardamone in 2011. It was a paper done in collaboration with also Julian Togelius, Georgios Yanakakis, and Pierluca Lanzi. And this basically in this paper they basically proposed several map encodings. One of them is the one we used in this work. And so basically this is a kind of simple idea. So basically the idea was to represent map as simple grids. So this is 64 for 64 grid, and in each cell of this grid you can encode an empty space, or you can have a wall, a solid space. The idea is not just to represent this as a binary encoding, so just empty or solid, but the encoding was done in this way. It's just a vector of triplets. So each triplets encode either an arena or a corridor. So there is a fixed number of arenas in the encoding of the map, and a fixed number of corridors encoding in this map. The triplets work as explained in here. So basically the first two components of the triplet is basically the position, the top left coordinates in the grid of the corridor or of the arena, and then you have the size in the case of the arena, or the length in the case of the corridor. Length is used also to distinguish between horizontal and vertical corridors. So you have positive length for horizontal corridors and negative for the vertical ones. And this is basically is the encoding of the map. So given this simple vector of numbers, you get some representation in this grid, and then you get create a real map in the game. So this on the right is not exactly the representation of the left one, but is an example of the map you can create with this encoding and with a large number of arenas and corridors. And after this process, there is also some heuristics that adds to the map some spawn points for the players, power-ups, and other ammo, and everything is needed to the map to be actually used in the game. So in another thing we did, we just changed a little bit the crossover representation, the crossover operator used in the original paper, because in the original paper when they proposed this encoding, just uniform crossover, one single point crossover was used. In this case, we thought a single point crossover could be too destructive in this with this encoding, because it just does not keep in any way the structure of the map. So we prefer to move to a matrix crossover. Basically, in matrix crossover is a standard crossover used when you have 2D structure in your encoding, and you basically is similar to single point crossover as a general idea, but instead of just choosing one point in a linear structure, you choose one cut point in a 2D structure, and then you recombine the area with respect to this cutting point. So, for example, in this case, if I choose this cutting point, I can choose to keep the left top content from the green solution, and keep all the other three quadrant from the blue solution. And in this way, I keep the structure of the map altogether. How we evaluated the map? To evaluate this map, so to understand how much map is actually fostering a fleeing behavior, we relied on simulation. So basically, the evaluation is performed running simulation on the map of matches with AI. So basically we run a 30 minutes simulated match involving 2 different bots. In this case we used bots with 2 different style of playing. One is called Berserker and the other Gunner. And we collected all the statistics of these bots during the match. In particular, to compute the fitness function, we considered how the AI routine of the game actually works. So basically, this is a simple is a representation, high-level representation of the behavior of the routines in the game. So it's a finite state machine. There is an idle state where is the player, where are the bots when they are looking for an opponent. As soon as they find an opponent to fight against, they move in the fighting state. The fighting state itself is divided into in 2 different substates. So basically there is a shooting substate where you basically are shooting to the opponent, and if for some reason the enemy is not in sight at the moment, because maybe it's behind a wall or not visible in that very moment, you go in a pursuit state. So basically you start chasing your opponent. So and you try to find again, to start again, to keep shooting again to the opponent. If one of the 2 bots is killed, you basically go back to the idle state. So if you are able to kill the opponent, you go back to the idle state, or if you are killed by your opponent, again you go back to the idle state. But it can happen also that if any a finite amount of time passes and you are not able to find again your enemy, you move again to the idle state. So basically the chase of the boss is not does not last forever, but at some point he stops chasing the opponent. So the fitness function is basically defined as the number of time the boss enter in the fighting state. So how many battles they face during the match. Sorry, the fitness function is how many times you go back from the fighting state to the idle state. So how many times a match an enemy is lost, or basically the opponent was able to avoid the fight over the number of actual fights in the match. So basically this represents how many fights in the whole match did not end up with the kill of the opponent, with the death of one of the 2 boss involved in the fight. So this is basically the idea. So this gives you how many is basically the percentage of how many battle did not end with killing one of the 2 opponents involved. So it was the results was escaping of one of the 2 opponents. Besides the fitness function, we also introduced some design metrics to analyze how the evolved maps looked like at the end of the experiments. The first one is the balancing. So basically balancing gives you an idea of how balanced the match was. So these are basically the entropy of the killing distribution between the bots, and this is basically one when the bots have the same number of kills during the match. Then we have this pacing function. The pacing function is basically gives you decrease as much time pass between a fight and the next one. So basically it's one when is different sequence. The sequence of fights is very close and goes to 0 as much time pass between two sequential fights. Kill streaks is another typical concept you have in first-person shooter. So it's basically the average of how many kills a single player do in a sequence. Fighting time is how much time with respect to the whole match time the boss pass fighting. So the proportion between the fighting time and the idle time. So basically, so these are our metrics. Which results we get with this evolutionary design. So first of all, this is the fitness function we get from these curves are averages over 12 different runs. This is what the blue one is the average fitness of the population. Red one is the maximal, the fitness of the maximal, the highest fitness in the population during the generation. So you can see from this plot that the evolutionary algorithm is able to increase significantly the fitness of the population, but you also see that this is not really a trivial problem for the map design, because at the very beginning in random maps basically you have a very small fitness. This means that less than 5% on average, on the average, less than 5% of the battles ends up with one of the two boss avoiding the fight. So basically this means that in general the bias is really toward fighting and not fleeing. And in the end, instead, you reach on the average almost basically 10% of the time. That is much higher with respect to the initial situation. We also analyzed their correlation between the fitness and the balancing, so and also the pacing. We see that there is no correlation with respect to the balancing. Instead, there is a correlation with respect to the pacing. So, as expected, maps that allows a fleeing behavior leads also to a significantly decrease of the pacing of the map. The same analysis was done also for the killing streak and for the fighting time. More interesting is this picture that gives you the overall idea of the map design. This is the maps in the early generation on the left and the maps on the late generation on the right. And here you see that green slopes means that there is a statistically significant increase on these metrics. Red slope means that there is a statistically significant decrease. Gray means that the difference is not statistically significant. So you see that balance does not change in any significant way. Pacing is decreased in a significant way. As I said before, the accuracy, interesting also, the accuracy increase in the late generation, the accuracy of the boss. That means that the evolved maps has more closed region, and this leads to an increased accuracy of the shooting of the bots. More interesting, even more interesting is looking at the actual maps. These are examples of the evolved maps. We have here we have early generation map, middle generation map, and on the right final generations map. If you look at the maps at the very first, they look very similar, but if you look carefully, you can see that what is really relevant here is basically that you have a circular closed path in the high fitness map. Instead, in this area, in this kind of map, you basically have a large central area where all the action happens. So in this case, there is not a circular path that goes through the whole map. And also more interesting is here you have circular path, but you if you just add one shortcut, in this case, the difference between this map and this one is basically that here you have a shortcut that allows you to cut this circular path, and this actually reduces a lot the fleeing behavior, the possibility of fleeing behavior. So just to conclude, I don't know, I have audio. I have the audio. If I have, there is. Oops, I don't think so.
What do we learn, Palmer? I don't know.
Yeah, I
don't know either.
Oh, okay. Okay. Okay, no worry. It was just for fun. I don't know how many of you know this film. Is the final scene about what did you learn, what did they learn in the movie, and what did he learn here. So, what did he learn? What did we learn in this work? So basically, first of all, that evolutionary computation, evolutionary design was actually able to foster a fleeing behavior, even if it's not really a trivial problem. The design, the feature of the designed map was basically the feature are basically maps are rather large to allow this fleeing behavior. They need to have a long closed path around all the map, and they also have a slower pacing. As the future works, we want to, of course, validate these results with human players to see how this evaluation we did with bots is actually perceived by human players. We want to also implement a fleeing behavior in bots, because in this case, all the fleeing behavior emerged in this map was not specifically encoded in the bot, in the AI routines. And you want to investigate also better the trade-off between pacing and fleeing, maybe using a multi-objective evolutionary computation to see if we can find interesting trade-off. And finally, also, instead of using heuristic, we also want to evolve the position of spawning points and resources. And that's basically it. Thank you very much.
Did both bots use the same state machine? Or
yeah, the bots use the same state machine, but they are slightly different. They have slightly different playing strategies. So the overall architecture is the same. The state machine is the same, but they have different parameters that they use. For example, to deal with the accuracy of the shooting, to deal with, for example, with the positioning, so how far stay from the opponent during shooting. In this case, the two bots we chose are quite similar, not identical, but quite similar.
Okay, so did you analyze the behavior over time? Because it could be that they just could not find so fast with a more convoluted mate, but after finding, they just shoot until they
well, we did a previous analysis, and of course, obviously, the largest is the map, and the highest is the time it takes to find. The easiest is also to avoid the opponent. But first of all, the fitness does not increase if they don't find. The increasing is if they find together, and at some point one of the two bots is able to just avoid is just able to escape the fight. So basically, if they just don't never find.
But what I don't understand is that in the state machine there is no fleeing behavior. So after they fight each other, they just shoot at each other. According to the state machine.
No. So basically here, as soon as they find, they start fighting.
Yes.
Sorry, it's gonna go away right now.
But how can it go out of sight? They still continue to run. They run while fighting.
No.
So because if I find you and I shoot at you and you shoot at me, we until one of us is dead, unless somebody moves away.
No.
But in the state machine they don't move
No, but
away.
they move because I understand. They move because basically they have strategical fighting behavior. So basically they just not go toward the opponent and just fight and that's it. So basically they shoot and try to take cover while shooting.
Okay.
So that's the behavior. And they can also move to get some power up during the fight. So basically it's not so basic behavior. They are things.
Okay, because
this was a simplification.
Hi. Hi. I'm Adam Somerville from the Expressive Intelligence Studio at UC Santa Cruz. So this is a vision paper on automated game design learning as a sort of subdomain field of study that we have been working on. The co-authors, Joe Osborne and Michael Matthias, and others that we want more people to be involved with. So this is a pitch to you all to start doing this too. So what do we mean sort of by game design learning? So here we have a nice scene of Mario, and there's a lot of aspects of the design that we might care to learn. We see here that Mario has jumped. This is a game with jumping. There's gravity. We see that there's sort of point structures going on. There's lots of numbers. So what do those numbers mean? We see that, there's interactions between, a fireball was, shot out by Mario and then hit a Goomba that then led to a state change in the Goomba. So there's all sorts of things going on and all sorts of things that we might want to learn for different purposes, which I'll get into a little bit later. And what we propose is to do this from observation and interaction with the game, not necessarily from like the source code of the game. The source code is sort of one way of implementing Mario. There's sort of, you can have infinite implementations of Mario that would emit the same behavior. And all we care about is sort of that which would be surfaced to a player, because that's sort of how most people actually interact with a game, learn the design of a game. Even designers themselves, that's why, bugs exist in games, because no one can hold that perfect image of a game in their head and put it perfectly into code. But they learn, designers themselves learn about the games via their interactions. So that's what we propose. Now, historically, we'd say that game design learning has been like a secondary goal for a lot of people, like say learning heuristics for GGP, general game playing. People aren't learning these heuristics because they want to learn about things about the games. They just want to produce a better player. But we think it's a worthwhile endeavor. It has its own unique challenges beyond just learning heuristics or something. It also has other rewards than just necessarily making a better game player. We've been working on it, and again, we want others to join us. And so this is sort of a high-level overview of what sort of we might mean, like that you have a game, you have input to the game, there's aspects of the engine that you can then take, apply automated game design learning sub-facets, and then get out sort of other content, and I'll go into that a little more in depth. So first I'll talk about why people might care about game design learning, what sort of has been done, and how those approaches have happened. One aspect of game design learning is sort of the hobbyist type community that has, is devoted to learning about games. There's, the notion of theory crafting, wherein users will do all they can to dig into a game, to try to learn the systems, learn all of the different, for StarCraft build orders, and game out which are the best, or how to spec their character in World of Warcraft, or what the best item spec to build for like Dota 2. And so there's a lot of digging in, finding all the numbers, and working at that level. Or in the fighting game level, most fighting games are composed of, we see the pretty pictures, but underlying the system there are a bunch of boxes, and they can either hurt or be hurt. And so, fighting game enthusiasts are very interested in what are those exact boxes, since that's what's actually, underpinning the simulation. And then, not quite hobbyist, but like Steve Swink, with Gamefeel, dove into a few games to look at the systems that actually underpin them, look at all of the parameters to, and how that surfaces in different types of feel. So, people are already doing it, but it's all sort of very localized communities, focused on their own very specialized task. And so we're sort of proposing that automated game design learning could sort of make it more general, make it easier to investigate a new game if there isn't such a community. And then on the sort of general game playing side, as I mentioned, there are people who have, done work on learning heuristics, learning what types of things hurt or help a player, trying to figure out what are the affordances of all the different entities in a game, or on the general game playing side, like, what is the game? Are there numbers in the game? Does the board, is it a grid? Things like that. So, but it's, again, been focused on creating a sort of more effective player for those types of games. And so general players are already doing some of this, but we'd like to sort of generalize these types of procedures so that it could be used in other ways, and also that other types of game design learning that is occurring elsewhere could make it into general players and make them more effective. So for work that I'm personally invested in, so I do procedural content generation via machine learning, and so these types of systems have relied on sort of human knowledge, human intuition about what are the important things, like what are the affordances of all the different tile types, what is an enemy, what's the ground, is something solid, does it hurt the player, does it help the player, and so all of this has been sort of done by a human, and then that is also therefore a slowdown in terms of gathering more data, because a human has to go through and annotate and for each game figure this out. So, can we automate the design knowledge portion of that to make it easier and more automatic to get the data required for these types of systems? And then there are sort of the design support tools like Rapossum or Tree Frog Treasure or Refraction, which are design tools that sort of do playability testing, or is this puzzle solvable? Is this puzzle solvable in the way that I want it to be solvable? Does it use the types of tiles and concepts that I want to play? Or are there shortcuts that I didn't intend? So these types of systems exist, but again, they require their own bespoke design knowledge per game to know all about it. So can we automate that so that we could create automatic solvers or automatic design tools for any general game that we're handed, and not just relying on specific knowledge about that one game? And then finally, as I mentioned, other people have sort of been touching on this, and so that's why we want to get more people doing it. So there's things like the GL end of Zelda, which does automatic 3Dification of NES games. And so, but to do that, it does things like learning, does gravity exist in this game? Is this thing solid? So background tiles that are solid are, raised up. Background tiles that are not solid make up the floor. So it learns in Zelda, there is no gravity, so it should interpret that it is a top-down view and not a side view. If there was gravity, it would learn that it should be a side view. So it's trying to learn the affordances, learn the mechanics, learn the properties of the game to do this. And then work from like Matthew Guzdial that was presented this last week at IGCAI is trying to learn an actual game engine for sort of definition of not like Unity, but learn the rules that govern, like say Super Mario Brothers, so as to be able to then automatically learn a rule system that if you then gave it same input could produce the same output. So other people are doing it, and we just want to make it a more focused domain, make a domain that people all care about. So now I'll go into a few specific examples of others and my own work. So as I just mentioned, there's the game engine learning from Matthew Guzdial. So for instance, say we have a frame of Mario. The goal of the system is to predict what comes next. The way it does this is it observes from an actual playthrough what comes next. Now, it's not operating on sort of image-to-image transformations. It treats everything, and this is just, it treats all of the facets of the game as just a list of facts about that frame. So, for instance, the position of all the sprites on the screen. So here we see, Mario's at one position and moves to another. And so there's this delta in the middle that Mario has moved. And the game engine is learning those deltas and the conditions under which they operate. So work that was done by myself and Joe Osborne that was also presented at IGCAI this week is SHARDA, which stands for Causal Hybrid Automata Recovery from Dynamic Analysis. And so what we have here on the right, you might not know, are actually sort of Mario jumps. And so there are sort of different facets of the jump. There's different modes. There's the portion where the Y position is on the ground, is 0. The Mario's on the ground. When you press the button, there's an initial impulse up. Then if you let go of the button, that cuts off. And then when you're falling, there's higher gravity, so it's not sort of perfect parabola. So there's this state machine that is governing Mario's jump. And so it's actually what we would call a hybrid automata, which is something a cross between a finite state machine and differential equations where, like a finite state machine, there are all these different states, and there's ways of moving between the different states. But within each state, there are values, and those values have different flow rates, as in differential equations. But they are, different flow rates and different resets upon moving into different states. So the goal of this work was, can we recover, like, say, the hybrid automata that governs Mario's movement just from observing these sort of arcs on the right? And so it takes place under a few different modes. So first of all, it does like a mode splitting to try to figure out where do I believe that these different modes are active. But each of these, one would be considered a different one. So the first portion where it's on the ground it would have to decide, I'm going to merge that with the next portion on the ground. I believe that being on the ground means the same thing in these states. But different types of jumps and different types of falling might lead to different ones. So this is sort of the output of it. It's maybe not the most comprehensible. The sort of black line is the true y velocity. The x's are the recovered velocities from the learned automata. There's some errors in there based on learning the transitions incorrectly or not, or for instance, like the blue x's that are sort of offset are because it incorrectly merges all of Mario's different kinds of jumps, the standing still, walking, running, into one. But for the most part, we can sort of recover these types of state machines directly from observation. And then work that I presented last week at FDG are the mechanics automatically recognized via interactive observation, specifically jumping. So if we know fully the structure of the hybrid automata ahead of time, how well can we learn the parameters that make up those structures? And so with a bit more design knowledge a priori, we're able to better recover. And so we see on the right the sort of the red X's are the true positions of jumps, and the blue lines are the learned jumps. But so we can learn all the parameterizations of the jumps, allowing us to sort of learn at a larger scale. So, for instance, like the work that Steve Swink did looked at jumps, but looked at 2 jumps from 2 games. And so the work here, by sort of automatically doing this, we're able to learn from 40 games. So, you know, we're orders of magnitude more games because we've automated this process. And so we're able to get more design knowledge out about a wider field of games than if we were just doing this manually on our own. And then finally, other work that I presented last week at the PCG workshop is Mappy, which it does automatic mapping of NES games. So it learns what rooms exist in a game by directly observing from the emulated NES, extracts out all of the sprite positions, learns the links between these rooms. And so by doing this, again, like as I said, like the PCG via machine learning that I am interested in, you know, requires more and more data, and so this allows us to quickly get data without, you know, needing a human being to have gone through and stitched screenshots together, and then, you know, if anyone was at my tutorial earlier, doing vision processing to then figure out what the actual things underpinning it are. And so now I'll go through sort of how we propose automated game design learning should occur, although, you know, it's how we've done it because we like it. It's not, you know, harsh, you must do it this way. So one idea that we find fruitful are operational logics, which are a sort of idea put forth by my advisors, Noah Wardrop-Ruin and Michael Matthias, that are the sort of core atomic bits that games are made of. And so the idea of operational logics is that they link simulation with communication. So there's some simulated act that is going on inside of the game, and then in some way that is communicated with the player. So for instance, like physics logics, like, you know, at the end of the day, what's happening inside of the game is that there are some numbers, and there's maybe accelerations applied to them, what have you, and then those are surfaced to the player via sprites moving around on a screen. And so we can know what types of structures are going on based on the observations of the things on the screen. Although there might be other ways of communicating that. You might have physics going on, and then, you know, a text parser might be displaying that to you. So there are different ways of communicating the same underlying physics or same underlying simulation. And then there are also things like resource logics. So for instance, in Mario, we have, you know, Mario collides with a coin, and then that increments a resource, not necessarily here. And then that, you know, if you hit 100, then that is converted into a different type of resource. So there are sort of these core transitions that can occur of increment, decrement, transfer, and those can be surfaced in different ways, by sounds, by a textual description, by Mario changing state from Big Mario to Little Mario, or vice versa. There are what we call collision logic. So, you know, what's shown on the screen are clusters of pixels, but underlying those there are, like, say, hitboxes. And so if those things overlap with each other, you know, we as humans interpret it as collision, and that can surface in different ways in the game. Or linking logics that, you know, there are these rooms that are inside of a room. There's this, you know, sort of standard Euclidean space, but then between these rooms there might be non-Euclidean links between them. There might be teleports. There might be other ways of linking these different spaces. There are state logics, and then there are also things like chance logics, where maybe there's stochasticity, or maybe there's the appearance of stochasticity to sort of a naive observer. Say, in Mario, hitting one question mark block might cause a coin to come out, and hitting another might cause a mushroom to come out. To sort of a person who doesn't know that Mario levels are static, they might think that this is a random occurrence. But by sort of thinking about these not at like sort of a mechanical level, not at necessarily jump or platformer or strategy game, but by thinking about games at these sort of core small bits, you can leverage sort of shallow domain knowledge across a wide range of different types of mechanics that might occur. And then there's sort of the portion which we label sort of deep technical knowledge. So in our work, we've been working heavily with NES emulation. So this is what the NES looks like on the inside. It's maybe not the NES that you hold in your mind. And so we've been dealing with the PPU, which is the picture processing unit. And that has all sorts of lovely information in it that is known and mapped out in different ways. There are the pattern tables, which hold all the different pixel patterns. There's the palettes. There's the object attribute memory, which has all of the information about all the sprites. There are the name tables and attribute tables, which hold all of the information about the background tiles. And so by sort of leveraging, going a deep dive into one system, we're able to extract out a lot of useful information. And sort of the other approach that I have taken in the past, and also others have leveraged, like computer vision. So say getting data from YouTube and then applying machine vision software on it with knowledge about, say, the tiles that play in a game, you can extract out, like, say, maps from a YouTube long play. And each of these has their own pros and cons, pitfalls. We prefer the emulation because it has sort of less opaque state. It's interactive. But then again, the vision allows for, there's a lot more people posting stuff on YouTube than there are posting their input sequences for playing a game. So you can have a lot more data, but you don't have any way to actually interact with that after the fact. So anyway, but this is sort of the type of sort of deep dive that is required, or that is going on with the sort of automated game design learning currently. So to conclude, I hope this has shown you sort of what we mean by automated game design learning. Hopefully you find it interesting. Hopefully other people will want to collaborate, and hopefully foster a larger community on this. We just got word yesterday that the first knowledge extraction from Games Workshop will be held at AAAI 2018 in lovely New Orleans. The CFP will be coming, I think, by the end of this week. So if any of this interests you, please submit papers, talk to us. We would like for this to become more of a thing. So thank you.
I think it's really, really interesting what you're proposing, and really, really thought-provoking. It's quite scary too, right? So you got a lot of big problems in there.
Yeah.
So I suppose one thing I'm thinking is that some of these might have easier solutions in some cases. So if you're trying to do this sort of learning about the game design, where you actually have the source code of the game, and you can run it fast, and you can run the forward model fast, and you can have sort of agents play the game and then measure the experience of the agents. Is that sort of thing, and we do this, for example, in our group, is that sort of thing the sort of thing that you're still including in this new topic, or is that kind of a different thing, if you see what I mean?
Yeah, I think it depends on what type of knowledge you're so for the sake of this workshop, I think that, like, if you are playing a game and interacting with the game and extracting knowledge from the game, like, that's certainly what we would be talking about. And yeah, like, obviously, like, we like emulators because they're fast and we can run things at a much greater speed, and so yeah, obviously.
To make the question more precise.
Okay.
So, supposing, for example, we've got a game emulator, we've got a bunch of clever agents, and we want to make them play the game, and we do that, and we look at the game logs, and we learn things about how they played it. Is that sort of thing included in this, or because we're not bothering to explicitly extract things like the physics logics or other
so
things?
You're looking at just like the play.
We look at the play traces of how the agents play the games. in I think sort of maybe simpler ways than you're proposing here.
So I think maybe, I mean, things like if you're, I'm not sure what your specific domain is or something. What is your specific? Maybe we can talk.
Well, for example,
specificities.
we do general video game AI, and
Yeah.
we do AI assisted game design. We look at the experience that the bots have playing the games, and try to figure out various aspects of the game quality from that.
Yeah, I'd say, I think in our mind, less things like maybe like quality, but more, yeah, so maybe less so, like not like was this fun or good, but other properties like that are more intrinsic to the game and not just sort of like based
Well,
off of.
I think the distinction I draw is that we look at every aspect of the experience of the agents playing the game, things like heat maps, things like the scores they achieve, the time playing the game, the sort of entropy, the action sequences, just anything that you care to measure about how they play the game without diving into without trying to recover the logic behind the game, I suppose.
Yeah, I'd say that's sort of like the fuzzy boundary of sort of what we're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Cool.
So when you know the rules, you could also use that to, I guess, generate new games, right? Or did you guys think about that?
Yeah, that's sort of I think the long-term pitch would be, yeah, if you can learn from all the rules of the games, or learn how to generate games that are sort of similar styles, or learn what types of rules should go together, what types of rules shouldn't, things like that. Yeah, definitely. Or just behaviors, learning. Like, we have all the different jumps. Can we learn, sort of general generatable model of jump? Like, there are certainly things that we can imagine as jumps, but maybe there are some that just shouldn't exist because they're just bad, or what are the properties of these jumps and things like that, or other behaviors.
I think we ran out of time. Yeah, very quick. Just a connection to the first ethics thing talk we had. Couldn't these lead to cannibalize existing games and emulate the game without these 3 rules, or with these 2 rules changed? And can you imagine that?
Sorry, the ethics of like learning how
that you are cannibalizing existing games, learning from them and tweaking them, modifying them in a way that after you extracted the rules, you can make variants of them.
Yeah. I don't see. That's what most game design is, or a lot of game design, or like, I mean, like, or at least a lot of. I don't think it's unethical. I mean, right? Like, it starts off vaguely unethical, perhaps with like, cloning. I think is often like seen as bad, but then once you sort of get it, like, right, like Doom and Doom likes like were Doom clone was a common sort of phrase. And now we just say first-person shooter because everyone cloned Doom and made their own slight variants, and it, grew into a whole genre. So, I think it depends on how wide it becomes and what those variants are. That sort of, at what level is it a clone, and at what level is it an homage in the same genre or something. But yeah.
Perfect. Thanks.
All right. Let's thank the speaker again.